So how do we describe an island paradise like this? Right? How do we compare living in Australia to living in the Solomon Islands? How do you compare a country where a beachside view like that is basically free to a country like Australia where a beachside view might cost you anything from $250,000 to $20 million? So, well, we might look at things like how crowded the island is. Right? So we might say, well, okay, people are better off if they live in less crowded places. Maybe that might be true. We might wonder about, well, what percentage of people have to live in high-density housing, living in cities? What sort of access do people have to rural or maybe virgin nature areas? Okay. So we can measure those sorts of things across different countries. So what I'm trying to do is say, okay, GDP is a very limited concept. And often when we're talking about GDP, we're just talking about GDP in Australia. And all we're really doing is comparing today's GDP to last year's GDP, because that's all anyone remembers. So I want you guys to step back a little bit and think about what GDP is really measuring and what these things are for. So I've got here some statistics for Solomon Islands, the SI, Vanuatu, both little countries to the northeast of us that we give foreign aid to, and we have a significant number of Australians living in and helping run. Australia, again, this is what, 2006, and Belgium. So we could look at the population and then the square mile area of the countries, and then look at the population per area. So the third column is what I'm interested in. Does density really matter? Right? The least dense place here is Australia at 2.7 people per square kilometre. There's a bit of a problem with that. What's a problem with measuring the square kilometrage of Australia? Why is that not the right representation about how crowded Australia is? Yeah. Almost everybody lives in the same places. Right? Australia actually is one of the most highly urbanized. Everyone, when they see holiday shots of Australia, they tend to see the outback. And everyone thinks, geez, all those Brits move over to Australia, think Australia has so much room. Now look at it. But the answer, of course, is there's not really that much room because everybody is concentrated in just a few areas. Most of Australia lives in Sydney or Melbourne. That's it. They're not very big. And there's not much places that Sydney or Melbourne, Sydney especially, can expand to. Australia is very not densely populated. But look at Belgium. 345 people per square kilometre. Belgium's an okay place to live from what I hear. Right? So actually, density of people doesn't seem to matter one bit. Australia's very low density. Belgium's very high density. But I've never heard anyone say Belgium's a crap place because everyone's living on top of each other. And Australia's a great place because it's got so much outback. Especially since everybody seems to live in Sydney. How well off are people in an island paradise? So again, this is the idea about looking at a place like Vanuatu or the Solomon Islands, where you've got that beachfront view that you have. So what do we see when we try to calculate the GDP of these places? Well, one of the problems with calculating the GDP of, say, a third world country like that is GDP assumes that there's markets where people buy and sell things, like in Australia. Right? When people in Australia want food, mostly they go down to Coles. When someone in a third world country wants food, they grow it in their backyard. And like I said before, something that you produce for yourself has no value as far as GDP is concerned, because you haven't bought or sold it for me. So in Australia, we go down to Coles and we buy things. That increases the value of GDP that we get. In Solomon Islands, people go out in their backyard and they dig up a yam, not calculated as part of GDP, because you grew that yam for yourself. So we might think, firstly, that when we go and try to calculate GDP for these countries, that we're going to bugger things up because of that, because they're not very well developed in terms of market economies. There's just not a lot of buying and selling between. But we go ahead and try to measure those sorts of things anyway. What typically happens is country experts will then estimate how much stuff is grown in the Solomon Islands. And then they'll attach a value to that, as if it were sold in the market. So on Solomon Islands, they produce so and so many thousands of kilograms of yams. And then you attach a price to yams, And so you estimate GDP that way. But a lot of these countries, it's not set up like we do. So if we go and calculate something like gross national income. So here I've got Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Australia, and China. Now again, I think this is 2006 numbers, not quite sure. Again, if you have a look at gross national income, right, you'll see that China is, of course, much bigger than Australia. What's the problem with saying China is therefore a better place to be? After all, China's economy is bigger than ours. Well, the answer should be, actually, but also China's population is a lot bigger than ours. We're not interested in how big someone's economy is. We're interested in how much stuff does that economy provide per person in that country. So Australia has a lower GDP than China does, but Australia also has 1/60th of the people that China does. So you're interested in GDP per person, not total GDP. So in this case, of course, Australia is one of the wealthiest countries on the planet at about $35,000 per person. China's at about 2, getting on 3 now. Vanuatu, about $1,600, $1,700 per person. So Vanuatu is at about the level of China. And Solomon Islands is significantly poorer even. So again, think about what this means. You guys could spend $700 in a weekend. If you thought about it. Go down to Sydney, stay at a hotel, go out for dinner twice, go to the Hordern Pavilion or something, $700 easy. Right? $700 is the total market value of all the things that a typical person in Solomon Islands would consume over an entire year. You can spend that on sort of a fling. You wouldn't even think about popping down to Sydney. Right? That's a very different sort of lifestyle for these people in those countries. They just simply don't have access to that much stuff. The other problem, of course, here is also a question of growth. So China's GDP is growing by about 10% a year and has been for the last 30 years. China's GDP will be growing per person by 10%. So the next year it'll be 2,200, then 2,420, then 2,600. You know, in a couple of years, by 2010, it might be close to 3,000 or 2,500. Just keep tracking that out. China's growing, so it's getting wealthier per person. So over time, China might be poor now, but in 2020, the average Chinese person will be significantly wealthier. Solomon Islands, however, is not growing. Solomon Islands had a GDP like this about 30 years ago, and it still has about the same level of GDP today. So Solomon Islands hasn't moved one bit. It's a bit like a lot of those African countries. Again, if you look at the Gapminder graph, a lot of those African countries essentially have not grown since the 1960s. They're stuck in the same old productivity problem that they had 50 years ago.